Soulmate left the Bahamas with its tracking off. The 46-foot sloop, owned by Brian Hooker and his missing wife, Lynette Hooker, slipped out of Marsh Harbor on May 8th, 5 weeks after Lynette Hooker vanished from Aunt Pat's Bay in the Abacos. A delivery captain, a disabled AIS signal, no declared destination. The U.S. Coast Guard Investigative Service is asking the public to identify a second sailboat moored beside Soulmate that night. And the surveillance footage from lovers' quarters captured something that should not have been there at all. If you want every development in this case as it surfaces, subscribe now, because this story is still moving. Lynette Hooker disappeared on the night of April 4th, 2026, in the Sea of Abaco. She was 55. She had spent more than a decade on the water. She and her husband, Brian Hooker, were living aboard Soulmate, a 46-foot sloop moored at the Conch Inn in Marsh Harbor. That evening, the couple left the Abaco Inn near Hopetown at around 7:30 p.m., heading by dinghy back to Soulmate in Aunt Pat's Bay. Sunset was 7:26 p.m. They departed into the dark. Brian Hooker told the Royal Bahamas Police Force that Lynette went over the side during the crossing. The engine cut. The wind pushed them apart. He says he drifted roughly 4 miles in 8 to 9 hours before reaching the Marsh Harbor boatyard at around 4 a.m. on April 5th. He was arrested 4 days later, held 5 days under a potential charge of causing harm resulting in death, released when prosecutors declined to file within the window allowed under Bahamian law. Less than 24 hours after publicly vowing to stay in the Bahamas until Lynette was found, he boarded a flight to Michigan. But the timeline he gave investigators, it is not the timeline the evidence supports. Start with the arithmetic. 4 miles, 9 hours. Sustained winds reported between 15 and 25 knots that night, with gusts approaching 40 miles per hour. A controlled drift demonstration conducted by sailor Blaine Stevenson in comparable 10 to 15 knot conditions covered 7 nautical miles in a single hour. At that rate, the 4 miles Brian Hooker says he traveled would have taken closer to 5 hours, not 9. A bartender named Ken at the Abaco Inn, a man who has worked those islands long enough to read the currents in his sleep, said the same thing in plainer language. 4 miles, even floating, even against current, should not take 9 hours. Then there is the dinghy itself. Brian Hooker said Lynette was at the helm when she went overboard. Her daughter, Carly Ellsworth, has publicly disputed that, saying her mother never drove the dinghy. Brian was always at the tiller. Carly Ellsworth has also alleged a prior history of violence in the marriage, including incidents of choking and threats to throw Lynette overboard. These are unverified allegations. Brian Hooker's attorney has denied them. He has not been charged with any crime. But the questions are no longer coming only from the family. For weeks, the public face of the investigation looked frozen. No charges, no body, no physical scene. The Bahamian file appeared to have closed. Then the U.S. Coast Guard Investigative Service confirmed it had opened a parallel federal criminal investigation. CGIS agents executed a search warrant on Soulmate, a digital video recorder, tablets, cell phone equipment, all seized, all currently in forensic analysis. And on May 5th, day 31 of Lynette Hooker's disappearance, CGIS posted 2 photographs to social media tagged "breaking," asking the public to identify the owner of a sailboat moored near Soulmate in Aunt Pat's Bay on the night of April 4th. A witness federal investigators cannot find. Do you think the owner of that second sailboat has already seen the CGIS appeal and is choosing silence? Or has the photograph simply not reached them yet? If the next CIGIS update changes what we know tonight, you will want to be here for it. Aunt Pat's Bay is small. It is a protected anchorage on the western side of Elbow Key, a quiet, sheltered inlet where cruising sailors drop overnight in the company of whoever else happens to be there. The water is calm. The holding is good. Boats anchored in it sit close. Close enough that a light on a neighboring vessel is visible from the cockpit without binoculars. Close enough that a figure on deck does not pass unseen if anyone is awake. A second sailboat was moored near Soulmate that night. Its occupants have not been identified. An internal CIGIS memo obtained and reviewed during the investigation describes the situation in unambiguous language. The owners and occupants of that vessel may hold information relevant to the federal investigation. CIGIS does not release photographs and tag posts breaking lightly. That decision tells you the witness gap is significant enough to outweigh the cost of telling the subject of an investigation where federal focus currently sits. Now consider what was reportedly happening at the Soulmate's mooring during the hours Brian Hooker says the boat was empty. Multiple witnesses describe seeing flares fired from the direction of Soulmate's position before 9 p.m. on April 4th. Under Brian Hooker's account, by 9 p.m., Lynette was already in the water. He was drifting in a disabled dinghy. Soulmate was supposed to be dark and unoccupied. Then there is the surveillance footage from Lover's Quarters, a small island directly across the Sea of Abaco with a sight line toward the anchorage. That camera reportedly captured light events at what investigators believe is Soulmate's mooring at 3 points across the night, approximately 7:47 p.m., 12:27 a.m., and 12:32 a.m. The 7:47 p.m. event sits 21 minutes after sunset. The 12:27 and 12:32 events sit in the dead middle of the night, hours after Lynette allegedly went overboard, hours after Brian Hooker says the dinghy lost power. The boat, under his account, should have been completely still. It was not still. And then on May 8th, Soulmate moved. For more than 4 weeks, Soulmate sat untouched on its mooring at the Conch Inn, watched, photographed, logged. The boat was the closest thing the case had to a fixed crime scene. Wherever the answers lived on that boat. Then a delivery captain boarded. Provisions were loaded at the Conch Inn dock. At roughly 10 a.m. on May 8th, Soulmate cleared Marsh Harbor heading west, past Whale Key, past Freeport, toward the open Atlantic and the United States. And the AIS, the marine tracking system that broadcasts vessel identity, position, and route, was switched off. Unknown data, no point of reference, no declared destination for a 46-foot sloop sailing across an international border with seized device equivalent still aboard. Brian Hooker was reportedly fired from AT&T years earlier for masking GPS data on his service vehicle. That detail is not a charge. It is a documented employment history. Whether the AIS shutdown on May 8th was a captain's decision or an owner's instruction is a question CGIS will now have to answer through different channels, because the boat is no longer sitting still in a Bahamian anchorage where it can be observed. A delivery crossing of this kind from Marsh Harbor to Florida runs roughly $4,000 to $8,000 once captain, mate, fuel, customs clearance, dockage, and provisions are added. For an asset valued near $100,000, the calculation is not unusual. What is unusual is the timing. A federal criminal investigation is open. Devices from the vessel are in forensic analysis, and the vessel itself just left jurisdiction. Meanwhile, CGIS interviews continue. A friend of the couple, sailor Blaine Stevenson, who recorded a phone call with Brian Hooker 3 days after Lynette disappeared, has now publicly urged him to be fully forthcoming with investigators. When CBS reached Brian Hooker's Michigan-based attorney, Crystal Howser, on May 5th, the same day the CGIS appeal went live, she ended the call without comment. Lynette Hooker's mother, Darlene Hamlet, and her daughter, Carly Ellsworth, have not heard from Brian Hooker beyond a single cryptic call hours after he reached shore. They are now raising funds through a GoFundMe titled Lynette Hooker Missing in the Bahamas to return to the islands and pressure the local authorities directly. Forensic nurse and private investigator Rachel Fisher, who reviewed the case publicly for an unaffiliated outlet, framed the standard plainly. Conclusions in cases like this are built when independent sources of evidence converge. Physical findings, digital data, environmental conditions, verified timelines. Until that convergence happens, every element of the reported account stays under test. And every week, the second sailboat remains unidentified. Witness memory degrades. The window narrows. This case has not gone cold. It has gone quiet. And the difference matters. A federal investigation is open. A vessel of interest has crossed an international border with its location masked. A witness on a second boat in a small bay holds an account that no forensic recovery from Soulmate can replace. The night of April 4th in Aunt Pat's Bay can still be reconstructed, but only if the person who was anchored beside Soulmate decides what their silence is worth. If this case matters to you, the next CGIS development is one you will not want to miss. Whether the light events captured by the Lovers' Quarters camera at 12:27 a.m. and 12:32 a.m. correspond to human activity on Soulmate and who that person was, is the question this entire federal investigation may now turn on.